Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Morag Watson. Morag is the Director for Onshore at Scottish Renewables, the Scottish Renewables Association representing the industry. And she's also been the industry lead for the onshore sector development deal. So welcome, Morag. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Nadim. It's lovely to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So you're just back from Denmark from the World Hydrogen Week, and you're going to be speaking next at our event Powergrid Leaders, the 12th and 13th of March in the Netherlands. Obviously, looking at grid connections. So I guess there's been a lot happening in the UK. We've had we've had a new government. We've got new regulatory environments being developed. So maybe. Could you give maybe an introduction into where we are in the UK and specifically Scotland, which is after all Europe's windiest country? So yeah, please go ahead.
We are indeed, and the weather is definitely proving that today here. So, in terms of what's been happening in the UK, we've seen a really interesting shift over the last 12 months. Historically, in the UK, we have always developed our grid reactively. A needs case would come forward, it would be consented by the regulator, and we would build out the necessary grid. And with our climate change legislation and our commitment to meeting net zero in the UK by 2050, but in Scotland 5 years earlier by 2045, everybody acknowledged that that system would never work for delivering a grid fit for net zero. And it was acknowledged for a long time that we would need to strategically plan our grid. But there was no legal framework for doing that. So that law was established last October with our Energy Act. And since then, they've been establishing the body, which is now known as the National Energy Systems Operator, which launched 3 days before we're doing this interview here. So just at the start of October. And what they have been tasked with is doing the strategic planning, initially just for the electricity grid in the UK, and then they will iterate that plan to bring in the wider energy system around heat and transport and industry and so on. And what we've really seen change since July, when our new government came in under a new administration, they've taken what we call a mission-led approach. So they have established what they call mission control in central government. They've brought in Chris Stark, who's acknowledged as one of the leading experts in the UK in energy and climate change issues, to head up that team. And they are tasked with bringing forward the plan that will enable all of this to happen. So that is a very different regime that we find ourselves in from what we were previously working with.
Yeah, exciting times, and hopefully, I guess fit for purpose. To further build out what is some considerable targets in terms of heading towards. I think it's 20 gigawatts in Scotland and 30 overall in the UK of wind, which is huge amount of wind to bring into the grid in what is a very short amount of time. Um, it's fascinating to talk about strategic mission-led approach and actually, I guess, put the grid first. Is that how you see it? Yeah, this is the grid, and we'll be linking, wind farms to that grid, as opposed to planning the wind farms and then thinking about the grid connections second.
Absolutely. So what we're moving to is anticipatory development of what we're going to need and anticipatory investment. So one of the things that's a bit of a gap in the policy at the moment is, previously from the Climate Change Committee that Chris Stark was previously CEO of, they had brought forward the six carbon budget, which was their advice to government on how we would achieve net zero. It was the first advice after the net zero target came in. And within the underpinning spreadsheets of that, it does give indicative amounts of how much renewables we will need. So for people not familiar with the UK, it's not exact figures, but the easiest way to remember it is we currently have about 15 gigawatts of offshore wind, 15 gigawatts of onshore wind, and 15 gigawatts of solar PV. What the Climate Change Committee indicated is that we're going to, by 2050, need to be somewhere around 95 gigawatts of offshore wind, 30 gigawatts of onshore, and 85 gigawatts of solar PV. And in order to keep you on track, that onshore wind deployment has to be achieved by around about 2030. So a doubling of our fleet in just over 5 years, which is
Yeah.
incredibly ambitious. So we have done the pipeline analysis. That's entirely possible, but one of the reasons for this discussion that we're having is one of the biggest barriers to the deployment is grid connection date, how long you have to wait and how much you have to pay for that. So now we are moving forward faster with that anticipatory investment. We would expect to see those grid connection dates shortening and the timelines becoming more compatible with what we're going to need to do.
Yeah. And some of the nuance and key in terms of that connection process. What are some of the key things? Prioritizing, and I think there was the issue to sort of clear out some of the speculative applications and make sure that the true projects can get connected. And what are some of the devil in the detail, as it were?
So for anyone who was quick on the maths, listening to what I was saying about those deployment targets, you would have calculated that's about 210 gigawatts of renewable deployment in addition to the hydro and things that we have already and nuclear. Again, it isn't clear how much storage we will need on the grid for all of that intermittent renewables. The last very credible piece of work I saw was by Aurora. It indicated maybe somewhere around 30 gigawatts. The current connections queue contains over 1,000 gigawatts of projects. So you can see there's a total mismatch, and a lot of those are quite speculative. There is a connections queue reform process going on to try and get these speculative projects out of the queue. And the original principle of design for that was first ready, first connected. But if you start to look at battery projects, they can be ready very quickly for connection. But then you start to skew your energy balance that you're putting a lot of batteries without that strategic plan of, well, how many do you need, where on the grid to make it most effective? So you start to bring in a sort of locational element to what you need to do, and you have a bit more of to use a term, a shopping list of what you need to connect to your grid, and your connection queue process needs to integrate with that, which again is not what it was ever designed to do in the past. So that's a design change that needs to happen. But because we haven't got the full grid design yet of what that storage and generation and flexibility and so on mix will look like, you're sort of in a bit of the muddle in the middle between what we had and where we're going. And it isn't quite clear what we're going to need. So that's very uncertain at the moment.
I mean, you could see a solution which is maybe nodal and distributing sort of targets in terms of that balance between wind or PV and batteries. But I guess it's complex. And in terms of where to connect, I mean, most obviously big offshore wind is clearly obviously connected into the transmission grid, but obviously you also have connections from some of the onshore projects into the distribution grids as well, which is just another level of complexity.
Absolutely. And that level of planning is now the next iteration of the plan. So picking up on what you were saying about the location, the current thinking is that the UK will be divided into different zones. Scotland is likely to be one zone. We thought perhaps it might be two because we have two transmission operators in Scotland, but the latest that we've heard is one. So the signal would be quite broad. It would say we're looking for this amount of generation onshore and offshore in Scotland, this amount of additional demand and so on. And that's how it would operate. And there has been some confusion in the discussions around this, that under the work that the UK government is doing around the reform of the electricity market arrangements, known as REMA for short, which is an acronym people may come across, there had been a proposal that there would be a zonal approach to charging. And now there's talking about a zonal approach to how the grid is planned. And some people who were unfamiliar with it had conflated the two and thought they were the same thing. And just to be clear, they're not. It's two different approaches to zonal. So that's all in the mix at the moment. And again, as we said, the organization that is planning this as we speak to each other is officially 3 days old.
Yeah.
They are moving at pace, and a lot of pre-work has gone into this as the organization is being established. and plans have started to come forward at a high level. But that detailed planning work is moving at pace. It's something that we as the industry trade body are very involved in, as are other key stakeholders in the energy system. We're expecting to see things come forward very rapidly, but again, a challenge that everybody who is interested in the space will be facing wherever they are in the world is you need to plan carefully, but you need to plan at speed, and those things are in tension at all times.
Yeah, there's the Ben Fluberg, who's the expert on building mega projects, always says that think slow, act fast. But here we've got to kind of try and think fast and act fast. But yeah, there's clearly some value in making sure things are well planned. And in terms of planning and the planning process and NIMBYism and objections, and what are some of your thoughts there? Obviously, the wind industry has had a multitude of issues, particularly in the UK over the last decade around that. What are some of your thoughts as we go forward in how do you alleviate those issues?
So this is a really interesting issue to unpack. So up until our new government came in place in July, there was a de facto ban on building onshore wind in England, very much based on a political perspective of the previous administration.
Yeah.
So we had a
newspaper, but let's not go there.
So we didn't build onshore wind in England at all. There was no such regime in Scotland because in Scotland the planning system is entirely devolved to the Scottish government, and they've always historically been very supportive of wind, and also Scotland is much windier. So that's why we have 60% of the UK's onshore wind fleet, despite the fact we're only 10% of the population. And we have done research. The Scottish government and UK government has done research. Others have done independent research to understand public attitudes to wind turbines. And what we consistently find is they have a really high approval rating, that most people actually like them or are ambivalent about them. And the percentage of people who feel that way sits around, the lowest I've seen in research was about 65, the highest I've seen is about 85% of people.
Yeah.
And again, the number of people who really object to them, and it's always on visual impact that comes down to how they look in the landscape. Those percentages, the lowest I've seen is about 3%, and the highest I've seen is about 7%. But that group is very, very vocal and makes their voices very much heard in the planning system. And it's a key principle that our planning system is democratic. People have the right for their voice to be heard within it, particularly if they're in a community that's impacted by these things. So that does need to be considered. But going back to our previous conversation about the speed at which we need to move to build out. So we need, last year when we signed the onshore wind sector deal in Scotland to achieve our onshore wind ambitions, we had 8 gigawatts and we need to get to 20 gigawatts by 2030. That's a really rapid build out. So getting bogged down in long-winded planning processes, and we have Viking, the biggest onshore wind farm in the UK at the moment, up on the island of Shetland. That was 15 years in development between grid and planning issues to bring forward something of that size. We just can't do that anymore. So this is a real issue that we need to wrestle with. What then lays on top of that is what we're seeing is the people who are previously objecting to onshore wind, that is now moving towards grid infrastructure, because we are going to have to build more grid infrastructure in the next 10 to 15 years than we've built in previous decades. But again, there's some really interesting research came forward from Ofgem, our energy regulator, about people's attitudes to this. And when it's explained to people that it's about energy security, it's about meeting our climate change obligations, people are actually fairly supportive of it, not quite as supportive as they are of wind turbines, but they certainly understand why it's needed. But what we've really lacked in the UK is a coherent national messaging and working both at community level and at national level to tell that story and to help people understand why this is happening and why the change. There's a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding out there about what this is and why it's being done. And it's going to be really important going forward to take communities with us.
Yeah.
Take them with us. We need them to have the information.
Yeah.
They may not like it,
Mm.
but they should be fully informed about what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Morag. It's been some fascinating to talk to you. Fascinating to see the movement in the UK finally. Well, not finally. I think they're probably being overly harsh. You know, the UK has ultimately deployed a lot of renewables and it's got a good approach going forward for the next phase. So yeah, it's all to play for. It's going to be a fascinating market to watch, and indeed fascinating to see if the UK can achieve those targets, which are very steep. So we look forward to meeting you face to face on the 12th and 13th of March. As I mentioned, you'll be speaking at the Powergrid Leaders event, looking at these grid issues in depth. So many thanks, Morag.
Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to carrying on the conversation in Amsterdam.
Cheers. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.